These are the three most important words I use as a teacher. Hi friends, welcome into Teacher's Talk. I'm Michael James Wong, and today we're talking about the three most important words that I have in my vocabulary as a teacher. Now, it's not meant to be a gimmick, it's not meant to be a definitive statement, but for me, I really have three words that I use in all aspects of my teaching, no matter what I'm doing, what I'm teaching, and what I'm sharing. And you might think to yourself, well, what are these? Are they things about how the body's supposed to be, or ways in which we're supposed to teach, or permissions that we grant? And in many ways, the answer is yes, all of that, but also no. Because for me, the whole point of a teacher is really about how do we support our students in a way that's helpful for them and gives them the space for consideration and awareness. And so the three important words in my vocabulary as a teacher that I use all the time whenever I'm teaching is perhaps, maybe, and it depends. Now you might say, okay, well, I get that. That's relatively obvious. But for a lot of teachers and for a lot of people, it's not. The idea that we approach a practice and we approach our teaching in a way that we can be of service to as many people as possible in a unique perspective that meets them where they are and gives them the space for consideration for themselves. The reason I'm very much about focused on using these words, perhaps, maybe, and it depends, it starts to validate the idea that I, as an individual, me as in Michael, or me as the teacher, don't have all the answers. I don't have a definitive understanding of what's going to work for someone individually, what's going to work for them uniquely, or just the considerations I don't know about or have no understanding about. When you use the words maybe, perhaps, and it depends, what you're doing is you're opening up the conversation for people to have their own sense of self-awareness, choice, and consideration. I know for me, over the years of practice, it's easy to get comfortable looking towards your teacher as the person that has the answers, that knows a lot more, that has insights that you don't have an understanding of. And yes, your teachers will have insights and considerations, learnings and wisdoms that you might not have ever come across before. However, that doesn't negate the uniqueness to my own personal experience as a student. It doesn't negate the ability for me to have my own thoughtfulness or consideration on what might work for me. There's so many times when I'm asked from students, hey, what do I think about this? Or what's the right way to approach this? Or how do I put this sequence together, or technique, or pattern of breathing? And for me, I've come through the phase where I really feel that my job and my role as a teacher is to give as much clarity and insight that I have to share. But always at the end, you'll hear me say, perhaps, or maybe, or it depends. Because each of those statements, while as a whole have the idea that consideration is necessary, it also removes the fact that you're taking my word as gospel. And there are times I'm going to have firm opinions, and there are times I'm going to have more information or more knowledge or insight than a student. And that doesn't mean I'm not going to share that. I'm not going to be vague about my point of view, or I'm not going to be generic about my answer, but I'm always going to leave the door open for consideration. Me saying, it depends, if someone was asking about the best breathwork technique for anxiety, or the best way to position a pregnant person when doing a meditation practice. Obviously, from my experience and my understanding as a teacher, when I'm working with someone who is managing anxiety, I'm going to look towards downregulation techniques. I'm going to look to techniques that can help refocus them, give them clarity and grounding. However, it may or may not work. Hence the perhaps, hence the maybe. Because there are always going to be outlying considerations or outlying conditions where someone isn't going to need the feeling of downregulation. So by me acknowledging the fact that perhaps, maybe, and it depends, what I'm ultimately doing is saying, please take my insight as valuable information, as helpful consideration, but also take ownership for yourself to recognize that this may or may not work specifically for you, and there also might be other perspectives that are valuable for you to take on board. For me, I don't believe that I have all the information. I don't believe that any individual has all the information, because even in all my years of life as a human being, there's considerations that no one knows about. There's all the things that happen in my personal life, in my brain, in the way I see the world, the opinions that I have, the sensations in my body, the pains and the aches that I have in my body. All these types of things are unique considerations to me. And so when I'm sitting with a teacher who offers the space for consideration, hey, this will be a great way to practice, perhaps. Or, and if I ask a question, hey, what do you think about this? And they say, well, it depends. Here's one point of view. Here's another point of view. Here's a point of consideration. Here's something you might want to think about. That allows me to know that this teacher comes from a place of both support and service and is taking one step back away from their ego and allowing an offering that says, here's points for you to learn, to know, but to also find your way through it. In many ways, there's no singular truth that will abide by a supportive way that everyone can get value from it. So here's an example. If I said, what's the fastest way from or if you asked me, what's the fastest way from my house to the train station? And I say, go out the front door, turn right, go down the hill, walk about 10 blocks or 4 minutes, and you'll reach the train station. On paper, that's the fastest way to the train station. But I can also say, that's the fastest way to the train station, perhaps. Because what if, as I walked out the front door, I jumped in my car and I drove there? I would cut the time in half. But if I'm not considering that there's other options or another vantage points or another consideration, sometimes we can easily fall into the space of here's a definitive response that I know from my experience is helpful for you. And so in my language as a teacher, simply unlocking that permission for consideration can really empower students to have an experience that is both receptive to my wisdom or my intelligence or my insight, but also to keep the ownership to have a widened perspective, to expand their awareness, and to take in considerations of factors that I might not know about as the teacher. And so that's what really this is about. Using this language, perhaps, maybe, it depends, gives you the ability to navigate your way as a teacher in a supportive way while giving your students the ownership to make the most of the wisdom and the insights that you're sharing with them. Now, the last thing I'll say on this is what's the difference between perhaps, maybe, and it depends? And again, they're quite synonymous in how they can be used because ultimately they're just unlocking a permission state for consideration. However, I'll often use the phrase it depends if I know there's an obvious juxtaposition in either or. So I could say, well, it depends. You could approach it this way or you could approach it this way. I might say maybe if I'm not quite definitively sure, I'm not 100% on my point of view. I could say, well, this is the way I would do something, maybe. And I'd use the word perhaps, because that's saying perhaps it may not be the case for you. Perhaps there's something different. And so whether you use any of those words or you have other words that you use that could be in that same realm of unlocking the permission for consideration, just know that as a teacher, the way in which you share your wisdom and your insights will be so well received when you give students ownership and participation in the conversation. One-way conversations don't work. What we need to do is start to cultivate and curate an environment when we're asked questions as teachers to offer a perspective and a point of view while also encouraging the curiosity and the consideration to know more. That's my perspective on 3 important words that I use in my teaching, no matter what I'm teaching, and hopefully that's a helpful little insight for you today. Thanks for joining Teachers Talk. See you next time.